Great. Why don't we get started? Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. As I said, I am David Lesher. I am the editor at CalMatters. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, statewide news organization. We launched about 6 years ago with a mission to raise public awareness about all of the major issues facing California. So this event is part of a series today that we are hosting with the Milken Institute about the future of work. We did several events last year and we have several more planned this year. So please keep an eye out. They're going to be good discussions. Today we're going to talk about an economy that's really emerging, as we know, from pandemic and recession, and especially what it means for those communities and people who are most impacted and who may be left behind without proper attention. Your CalMatters host and moderator today will be Jackie Botts, who covers the economy and inequality at CalMatters as part of our California Divide project, which is really an unprecedented media collaboration throughout California, where CalMatters has embedded reporters at newspapers throughout the state to cover the issues of poverty and inequality. We are committed at CalMatters to being a really trusted source of information about all of the major issues in California. So I'd encourage you to visit us at calmatters.org, to subscribe to our daily newsletter, and help support this free source of quality information by making a donation. So finally, I want to thank a tremendous group of panelists. I'm really looking forward to a great discussion today. Jackie will introduce the panel. Now I want to thank our co-hosts at the Milken Institute, and to introduce our co-host, Matt Horton, who's the director of the Milken Institute's California Center. Matt?
Thanks, Dave. As Dave said, I'm Matt Horton, and I'm a director at the Milken Institute's California Center. Like CalMatters, the Milken Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit economic policy think tank. And we're also really excited to be partnering with CalMatters to bring you this series of conversations, which aims to explore the opportunities that can enhance equity and other opportunities in the economy in a post-COVID future of work landscape. So, as Dave mentioned, even before the pandemic induced a statewide budgetary downturn, I think we're all kind of familiar with California's economic landscape being kind of far from, very equitable, with some, fostering some of the poorest census tracts in the nation. The COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated these underlying inequities, exposing the various differences and opportunities afforded among the state's different demographic groups. These consequences have had disproportionate effects on women and underserved Black and Brown communities, affecting their abilities to meet basic needs and acquire protections through the social safety net, or simply stay in the workforce and strive for more equitable economic mobility. So, through this work, we hope to, we think we can, better figure out how to distribute the state's past economic success in cultivating a more economic or inclusive economic recovery that aligns investments and coordination that increase access to education, housing, and result in higher paying opportunities and employment opportunities around the state. So, we should just get to the conversation, and I'd like to introduce, as Dave mentioned, Jackie Botts, the economy reporter for CalMatters, who will introduce our esteemed speakers and panelists for this session, and thanks for tuning in.
Hello, I'm Jackie Botts. I am a part of CalMatters California Divide, as Dave mentioned. We cover economic inequality at the local and state level around California, and I am so excited about this very timely conversation with our fantastic panelists about the post-COVID future of work. I will introduce them in a second, and first just want to sort of set the stage for this conversation. We're at a point a year into the pandemic where it's a really good time for sober reflection on what the pandemic has revealed to us about California's economy. The ways that access to resources, stable housing, space to quarantine in your own home, well-paying jobs with benefits and protections, employers who look out for your safety, an internet connection at home, opportunities to go back to school for a new career, a personal safety net with your family and communities, a government safety net that catches you. All of these things have marked the difference between life and death, literally, over the past year. And we have, quite painfully watched and experienced in our own communities the way that California's economy was sort of set up to do exactly what it did during the pandemic: protect a wealthier class, but also leave low-wage workers, especially immigrants, Latinos, Black Californians, disproportionately women, very vulnerable. The pandemic has given us a lot of information, you could say, and it has accelerated so many long-term forces in our economy: job displacement among lower wage workers, pressures on working mothers, higher unemployment rates among racial and ethnic groups who have been excluded from accessing high quality jobs for decades and centuries. And we've seen the ways too that our safety net and our unemployment benefit system, our childcare systems were not ready to take on a disaster. So in essence, we have been shaken to our core, but this is also a timely conversation because there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Businesses are opening back up. We have high rates of vaccinations, and politicians and advocates are talking a lot these days about an opportunity, a big opportunity we have to build a future of work that is far more equitable. We happen to be in a situation where the state of California is flush with cash, something none of us might have imagined a year ago at the start of the economic downturn. We have a budget surplus that was announced yesterday of $75.7 billion, thanks to tax revenue from the incredible gains in wealth and income of our elite class during the past year. We have federal dollars in the billions, and we have the chance to do a lot of rebuilding. So beyond playing catch up, the question we're going to be talking today about is: how do our government policies and programs, education systems, our businesses need to change so that the future of work is one that makes Californians whole every day? Lots to talk about. I will introduce our incredible panel now. First, I'd like to highlight Assemblymember Lorena Gonzalez, a Democrat from San Diego, who chairs the Assembly Appropriations Committee, also sits on the Labor and Employment Committee and the Judiciary Committee. She was behind AB 5, the state law to classify gig workers as employees, which has gone through a lot of litigation and controversy. She has been busy this year authoring a slate of bills aimed at protecting low-wage workers as we emerge from the pandemic. We have Rob Lapsley, president of the California Business Roundtable, nonpartisan organization comprised of leadership of major employers throughout the state. And before this role, he had a long career in business policy as an employer, a lobbyist, and a policy worker himself. We have Aleida Ramirez, an up-and-coming small business owner who currently lives between Mexico and Concord, California, in the Bay Area. She worked a number of low-wage jobs before the pandemic, wiped those jobs out, and she has spent the last year finding creative solutions to overcome a very challenging year, playing double duty as a single mother and also sort of a teacher, helping her daughter with online school at home. You can read more about her story in our Staying Sheltered series, where we profiled renters fighting to stay housed during the pandemic. And finally, we have Sarah Bone, Vice President of Research and a Senior Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, which brings nonpartisan research to important policy issues in California. They are a major source of data for me as a reporter. And Sarah Bone's research focuses on social safety net policy, education policy, economic mobility, and immigration policy, among other things. So let's jump into it. We're going to sort of cover 3 different topics. We're going to talk briefly about what the conversation about the future of work looked like a year ago before the pandemic, where we are now a year into it, and then we're going to leave the most time to talk about the future of work going forward. And we're going to open up around 12:50 for questions from the audience. So get your questions ready. We're looking forward to answering them. And I will start by asking Sarah Bone to jump us up by giving us sort of a picture of what the conversations around the economy and the future of work looked like on the precipice of the pandemic. What did the job market look like following the last recession? And what trends were we seeing in terms of job displacement and inequality?
Thanks for the question, Jackie, and thanks for hosting this great conversation. Not that long ago, though it kind of feels like a long time, about a little over a year ago, we were talking about our hot economy, and some were worrying that it was overheated. We had the lowest unemployment rate in at least 40 years at 4%, and a really long historic run of job growth. But the reality was at that same time, we had persistently high rates of poverty, reflecting the fact that jobs were kind of not all providing the kind of economic security you would hope for in a hot economy. So in California in 2019, the bottom 20% of families earned no more than $40,000 a year. That's for a family of 4. And the top 20% earned $200,000 or more. So that's a kind of 5 times gap, which is large by historical standards. It had actually narrowed a little bit in the last year or two before the pandemic hit. And that's because wages for low income workers finally started to increase due to the tight labor market. But it had taken us like 10 years to get there. And, circumstances furthermore kind of varied a lot across the state. I'd highlight 2 dimensions. The first, regionally. So Bay Area families recovered from the Great Recession a lot more quickly than elsewhere in the state. In fact, top income families in the Bay Area took 5 years to recover from the Great Recession, about a little less than half the time it took middle income families in the Central Valley to recover. So the reality was that kind of many families across the state had barely recovered from the Great Recession before the pandemic hit this last year. The other big divide is demographically. So even during the kind of hot economy, Black and Latino families were much more likely to find themselves in that bottom 20% of the income distribution rather than in the top. And the opposite was true for white families. So this kind of high level of disparity and poverty was really kind of a persistent feature of the economy kind of pre-COVID, where the fastest growing jobs were really at either extreme, low wage jobs in personal care and food preparation, in warehouse kind of material moving, and in high wage roles like registered nursing and software developers. So I think the question to me back then and still today is, what is in the control of policymakers, individuals and institutions to help us kind of create more equitable and wider access to the kind of higher paying jobs or pathways to them that can provide for greater economic security broadly across California.
Yeah, so we were seeing an economy that had perhaps a great headline and then a lot of more complicated and unequal stories underneath that headline, right? Aleda, I would love to hear, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us, what did your life look like before the pandemic? What were your financial goals for your family, and what about the economy worked for you and didn't?
Well, thank you, Jackie. Before COVID, the pandemic, I had a full-time job. At some point I had 2-3 jobs because it was that much need of income, especially to live around the Bay Area. But we had a stable income at home, and we were able to provide and to save and to pretty much have a normal life. Once the pandemic hit, everything changed. From my daughter's school, I depended so much from her time at school to go to work. So everything just turned into a different direction. So we can definitely see our life changing before COVID and after COVID, how it was such a big impact on our income, especially losing our jobs. Restaurants were shut down or reduced to business, and many of us losing our jobs, and not being able to leave as often for work due to having kids at school at home. So,
what sorts of jobs were you working, and what were your aims going forward financially?
Well, before pandemic, I worked at restaurant. I managed restaurants, and now during the pandemic, we came out with this idea of like selling what we built online. And because we're starting these new businesses, I have the flexibility to be moving between Mexico and California. I thinking of going back to be an employee, more of like me creating employments for somebody else. It's a whole different history right now. It changed my mentality from being where I was to now being able to provide an opportunity to somebody else that might benefit from what we're creating here. So that changed throughout the pandemic.
Absolutely, thank you. Rob Lapsley, what did the post-Great Recession economy look like for the business owners who you represent right before the pandemic hit? Who were the winners and losers from your point of view?
So Sarah, thank you. And also Milken and to CalMatters for the discussion today and for including us in that. So, from the California Business Roundtable perspective, we look at the entire economy. So yes, we have large employers, but we also have medium size. And so we track all of these trends. And when I first started here in 2011, coming out of the Great Recession, we have spent a lot of time with our sister organization, the California Center for Jobs and Economy, in being able to show how our economy has changed since 2011 and then where we were today. So what happened back in 2011 is we really grew this two-tier economy. We grew low-wage jobs, as we just talked about. Sarah did an excellent job at Jackie. And what we did is we grew high-wage jobs, and we've lost this, and are losing this base in the middle. There's no surprise that people are moving out of California. There's no surprise we've lost a congressional seat under apportionment because we're losing a middle class who can't afford to stay here under the cost of living. But that represents a blue collar middle sector base of jobs where people could come in, didn't have to be college educated, had an opportunity to be able to grow with a company or a private sector job and provide for their family under, hopefully a cost of living where they could still get a house and provide an education for their kids. And that's what our policies right now are impacting and what we're seeing. So now you fast forward to the pandemic. So yes, everything we talked about, the pandemic has exacerbated that division. Obviously, the low-wage jobs have taken an incredible, devastating hit on where we are because of the sectors, logistics, obviously the restaurants being the biggest one, tourism, right? All those affiliated lower wage and jobs, but at the same time, our high wage jobs have resulted in, what we see in the growth of Silicon Valley. They've created 40% of the jobs since 2010. They maintain the job space in this state. And I think one thing that we can get into today, later on, is that we can't mistake a $75 billion surplus for necessarily a healthy economy either. It comes from a certain sector. There are specific reasons, but I'd like to, talk a little bit about that for what we look at from a longer term policy perspective. And again, all this also incorporates the retail jobs. All these pieces are, what we have to look at of how they're changing and how we have to look at, are we going to bring them back? Or is that something we have to adjust to long term? And then lastly, our biggest sector of growth is healthcare. Obviously, that's a more educated workforce. And so what we do with education moving forward, particularly after what happened with schools, is of great concern for us in this discussion too.
Thanks, Rob. Before the pandemic happened, there was a California committee called the Future of Work. And there was a lot of hair pulling and research being done and conversations being had about this very thing that we're now talking about a year later with a new perspective and a hard year behind us. Assemblymember Gonzalez, in the Capitol, from your perspective, where you were sitting, how were policymakers, lobbyists, and activists talking about the future of work? What were your priorities and what were the competing agendas that you were seeing at the Capitol?
So I'd be happy to talk about my priorities. They probably go into the next segment on where we go from here, because I think the community I come from, we're facing the inequities that we're seeing just grow under the pandemic. So a lot of the things that people are now fretting about, we already knew existed. We knew there were problems with job security, with growth. We did some very good things, I think, early on in my term. We, of course, increased the minimum wage. That was important. We provided paid sick days. We did a lot, in particular for women, a lot of that led by former Senator Hannah Beth Jackson. We took on pay equity kind of at the 30,000 foot level. We talked about we extended paid family leave. We talked about women on boards and commissions. So we were doing a lot of work and a lot of space. My focus, I think, and not always the focus of the assembly as a whole, really is on low wage workers, the communities I represent, the community I come from. So I think that was starting, but I think the reality, kind of what Sarah was explaining, like the differences between what the top 20%, low 20%, that means, the inequities that I see every day, maybe 20% of us see those every day, right? So it's a little bit of it was hard to get some attention. Obviously, because of Dynamex, we were able to get attention on misclassification, which gave us an opportunity to try to take that on, continue to take it on with AB5, and to talk about benefits that, by the way, in a few months, we'd learned how important they were, those benefits that are paid into on behalf of employees that aren't on behalf of independent contractors. So, a lot of it was historic work we needed to do, increasing diversity, increasing women in the workplace, dealing with women in the C-suite. Those are important things. Paid family leave for those who can afford it with a 60% wage, replacement. So we're going from that to the work, I guess we can talk about in the future. The other thing that I liked that we were starting to tackle, and I think we will continue to tackle, is this. So anytime you talk about job protections, we get two responses from the business community. One, it's going to cause robots to come take your job, or number two, everybody's going to go to Texas, right? It's the two things that, despite studies showing otherwise, we get told. So we started to focus on low wage jobs that we knew couldn't be outsourced and couldn't be automated. So things like childcare, we gave childcare the right to unionize. That was huge. I mean, when Mr. Lapsley talks about high-end jobs in the healthcare industry, and I think somebody mentioned nurses, I think back 40, 50 years ago when my mom started as a nurse, it was a pink-collar career, 2 years at community college, and a very lower middle class job. That was grown into what we see today as a great job because of the unions that increased density in the space and helped change the workplace. So we were starting to work on that in childcare, and I think that's something that'll continue as well through this.
Thank you all. Let's talk about where we are now today. So we're going to fast forward a year, a very challenging year that we've all experienced in many different ways. And some of us have been far more exposed to the risks, financial pain and distress than others. The economy is picking up, but new data also paints a mixed picture of our recovery. The state still has 1.5 million fewer jobs as of March than it did in February 2020. And the lowest paying jobs are still hit the hardest. High unemployment rates continue to disproportionately affect Black and Latino Californians, especially women. And as we open up, these are trends that could very well, accelerate. So let's talk about what this past year has looked like. Alayla, how has the pandemic affected your life as a single mom? How has it affected your community members, the other women and single moms who you have worked with over the past year, who you have mutually supported over the past year?
Thank you for bringing this up, Jackie. Definitely, many of us, and as I mentioned earlier, depending on the school time of the children for us to go out and have a job and have a steady income. The after school programs, it was a time where we had to pretty much fit in a full-time job or 2 part-time jobs. With the pandemic, having the children at home, that entirely changed for us. We all were impacted, but single moms, we were the ones bringing the income. We were the ones providing for our home, our house, food and shelter. The pandemic, many single moms that I represent are undocumented women that were in the labor force of the Bay Area that lost their income. But not only that, but they also don't have government help or stimulus check or grants or food stamps programs that can help them to survive during this time. So it was for us, me as a citizen, I was impacted because now I depended on my daughter's school time in order for me to figure out what can I do. And then the time after school is being with her, helping her with homework and getting caught up and adjusting literally to the new way of learning, because for the kids, it was also an impact. So when it comes to our economy, that's when many of us face a tremendous hardship. to that, the cost of living in the Bay Area or entirely in California, it went triple in the past 10 years. It has been outrageously horrible, the whole gap between income and cost of living. So yeah, it was definitely a big impact to many of us.
And I know that you, over the past year, have at many different times come up with creative ways to get through this. You picked up gig work, you started your own business, you started living between Mexico and California. Tell us about these ways that you found ways to cover the bills.
So basically throughout the year, we depended so much in family and friends support and encourage each other to literally not go mad with this situation. So at the end of the year, I did an interview where I was able to get some funds from kind people who help us out because we were going through a hardship. I pretty much went through all my savings during the first 6 months of the pandemic. And it was a point where we had to decide, like, what do we do now? You know, I can't leave my daughter at home and I can't leave her without a roof. And friends were like, well, why don't we build these decorations and maybe you can sell them online or do something. That's how we started doing the planters. And with the help of that, I mean, I've been in the fact that my daughter is able to take classes online, we're able to live here 2 weeks or a week and a half out of the month, and then going back to sell the products that we build here in California, just in order for us to save at least some food costs and, you know, work here and then go back and work in California. We have had the talks with my daughter of like moving to Mexico, but we all love California, and she keeps saying, yeah, it's going to be tough, but we can't leave home. You know, there is an attachment to build the state in a way, build the city, and not being part of the ones that run away from what we're doing. So in a way, my daughter's support and my friends' support are the ones helping us to face what we're going through in California right now, and pretty much in the entire country and the entire nation. But we just pretty much were creative enough to build a product that we know it has a market, we believe it has a market, and now we're focusing on just growing that. So
Alayla is calling into this call right now from Tijuana in Mexico. She's on one of her 2 or 1 week stints there, and then she'll be coming back to the Bay Area to sell. Rob, I'm wondering if you can talk to us about what you saw about which businesses were most heavily impacted and what trends in business did the pandemic accelerate from where you sit?
So clearly, tourism and restaurants were the most heavily impacted immediately. I mean, we had over 50% of the restaurants close. As you know, over 60% of the restaurants represent an entry-level economic opportunity for somebody from a community of color to be able to get into our economy and be able to create a future for themselves and their family. So what that represented, you know, was not just the one restaurant. It represented not their workers, but most importantly, generations for their family. And so, you know, along with that, from, you know, the incredible base, hotels, tourism, conventions, all of that literally was turned off overnight and continues to be turned off, you know, as we wait to see how things progress to June 15th and then beyond, you know, with vaccinations. So still some key pieces to be raised in order of trying to recover. And with that, you know, want to talk about, you know, some observations that came out of this. 2 things. One is that we would hope from a policymaker standpoint, there would be, you know, a huge amount of attention paid on oversight on how to restructure the social safety net when some of these things happen. Certainly EDD is part of that. There's a lot of work and examination that needs to get done on a good policy basis moving forward. And it's time. We have lessons learned from this pandemic that should be able to provide really good, timely information to make some structural changes on how things can get done different in a positive way. It should all be positive work. This is not repercussions, just good structural oversight. Number two is for the business community, we have a monumental shift in a positive way on obviously telework. That really should be the driving force moving forward on how we can modernize some of our labor laws to be able to incentivize telework on a permanent basis. And with the telework changes, we also get the environmental benefits. We should be able to keep 20% of all the cars off the road on a given day when people come back to work, because employers have real life experience and understanding and accepting telework. But they will if they're incentivized from understanding liability standpoints, some how our labor laws apply. And if those changes are made, then you're going to get both employee flexibility, you're going to be able to get obviously employee benefits, you're going to be able to get environmental benefits, and you're going to be able to cut down the wear and tear on our roads and really have a positive change that came out of one of the greatest health threats in our lifetimes. So we look forward to that discussion moving forward to be able to accomplish some of those things.
And of course, access to telework has been, again,
Yes.
incredibly unequal over the past year. I want to touch on a point that you made about government safety nets, and actually go back to Aleda and ask this question, because I know that you have had quite the experience trying to take advantage of grants and aid from the government over the past year. Aleda, what has it been like to try to access California's safety net?
Not much luck. I personally had issues with EDD where until now I'm still trying to get a hold of somebody over the phone, and it takes so long to the point that I decided to give up on many of the government funds and help, because if it's not one thing, is the other, and realizing, well, rather than asking the government, who is apparently too busy with millions of people asking for help, I'll just make a way to create an income for myself and build the economy in a way. So, some of us just give up and try to find ways. And some people are really patient in that matter, and they really take their time to do it. I personally like to have the solutions right away, to create the solutions right away, because I as a single mom, as a parent, one of our priorities is food and shelter for our children. And whatever it takes, that's what we're going to do to make it happen. So to me, sitting down waiting for the government to respond or to help me or to pay my bills or my rent, it doesn't cut it. So my decision was, let's build this, let's make it happen. And in a way, we add to the economy, we bring, we create something that it's going to help us, and it's going to help the state in a way now. We register the business, learning from scratch how to open up a business. So.
Thank you. I think that the answer that you gave is probably extremely familiar to Assemblymember Gonzalez, and also hurts to hear as a policymaker. Assemblymember Gonzalez, what did the pandemic do in terms of shifting the conversation, the legislative priorities around economic inequality and the role of government in intervening in inequality? How did it affect your priorities as a legislator? I think you already mentioned a lot of these were already on your radar. A lot of these issues were already on your radar.
Well, we were working on these issues. I remember back to our discussions on AB5, quite honestly, and a lot of times we would talk about access to unemployment insurance, access to workers' compensation, access to SDI. And it seems like the abstract, right? When you're talking about something that maybe people need once in a while, and then the pandemic hit. And I think a lot of legislators realize, wait a minute, if we don't have people paying into unemployment insurance, which we didn't, then we have to rely on this federal, basically gift from the federal government, taxpayer dollars, funding what employers should have been funding the entire time. We of course owe the federal government money now for unemployment insurance that was paid out to people who never paid into the system. And so there was a lot of, I think as legislators right away, I think folks who might have rolled their eyes a little bit when we'd start listing all these safety net programs that people needed access to and quality access to once the pandemic hit. I think EDD in itself has been a problem. I want to plead with Ms. Ramirez, if you qualify and didn't get your money, please contact our office. We'll help with that. Like it is just heartbreaking to me to hear that story. EDD is an interesting thing in itself and something we're going to have to deal with in the future. But there are a couple things to remember, not always reported in the media. Vast majority of the fraud issues in EDD came about because of the PUA, not because of our traditional EDD system. The traditional system, in fact, works quite well and safeguarded against fraud because of the way the employer and the employees both report data into the UI system. So a lot of the fraud came from the fact that we don't have information about workers that are working for companies and could claim it and had to claim it. We had to get money out fast. There are also longstanding issues with EDD that were highlighted and we should have fixed right after the last recession. We knew that there were IT problems. Of course, when it starts being a crush on the system, we let go of it. It's not sexy to fix anymore. It's a huge investment that still needs to be made. But a new thing that we're learning now is really the cost of outsourcing, right? So when we were talking about getting that help that Ms. Ramirez wanted from EDD, getting on the phone with somebody, we suddenly have this multi-billion-dollar, going out the door to Deloitte that subcontractors and then subcontracts, and pretty soon you're talking to somebody in Georgia who, quite frankly, doesn't know anything about our EDD system. And yeah, you got somebody pick up the phone, but that doesn't do any good. We have to talk about the robust nature and the attractiveness of public sector jobs like those in EDD to ensure that we're actually recruiting and retaining really good workforce that sometimes is going to seem excessive, right? We're going to sometimes say, oh, we should cut back some. But if we don't have a stable workforce, then when we end up in situations like this, when we end up in our next recession, we're not going to have the workforce there who are knowledgeable and able to fulfill that system. That's what happened here. So a lot of the stuff we talked about in the early 2000s, the stuff that we got hit with when I was at organized labor about cutting public sector jobs, about outsourcing jobs, that turned out to not be a very good idea. When we talk about cutting pensions and cutting people's pay, like that's not a very good idea when you really need those people to come and do a job and be qualified to do that job. So I hope we re-examine. And those can and should be good jobs. They should be the future of work, should be a good middle-class job with some retirement, healthcare, and a living wage. That's what we should expect in all sectors. So hopefully the war in the public sector can be ended and we can invest in departments like EDD in the future, in departments like the Labor Commissioner's Office, in these jobs that are crucial in order to protect our lowest wage workers.
Thank you. Sarah, can you help us understand sort of the larger economic and demographic trends that have become clear from the data that you sift through? Which workers and businesses have been most affected? Where are people moving? And to what extent has government helped over the past year?
Sure. Well, I think a number of people have touched on how kind of the economic experience over this past year has exacerbated divides along income, education, race, things that I talked about initially. The other kind of important trend that I want to spend a little more time on is how kind of our experience has shown this past year has shown how modern work relies on kind of people being able to balance work and family care, childcare. And this affects women in the workforce more than men because even in families where there are kind of two adults working, women tend to bear more of the childcare responsibilities. But I think as Aleda's experience shows, our economy really runs on women and men working substantially. So this is very different, of course, from many decades ago, but pre-pandemic, 60% of adult women and 70% of adult men were working. And the pandemic really changed that, leading to more exits from the workforce for women, especially those with school-age children. So I think this really has kind of shown a bright light on kind of the need for our kind of system and our economy to provide more opportunities for kind of flexible and affordable childcare that can address some of the constraints that women especially, but men as well, face on their choices in the labor market because they're balancing these multiple things. And that's also kind of course, important to watch for the recovery, which, you know, I think maybe contributed to the less than expected good news about the April jobs report that was out recently. On the point about kind of government intervention, you know, all of what's been raised about the challenges of getting these benefits to families over the past year are so valid. But when we look overall, kind of the government intervention and the stimulus over the past year has been pretty historic and has averted poverty for many. Of course, not all, but for many. Just thinking about kind of the scale of the stimulus checks that went out through kind of the tax system, but for a family of four could be as much as $10,000 over the past year. And you know, the unemployment insurance has had its major challenges, but I would also want to highlight some of the expansions that have been important that also we might want to think about going forward. Things like who's eligible for unemployment insurance. Typically, if you don't have much work history, if you're part-time or self-employed, you would not be eligible like other workers for unemployment insurance. Those are that's one of the kind of expansions that we've seen over the past year that has helped reach more people through the unemployment insurance system. And of course, kind of the generosity of the benefit helped more people who were out of work due to the pandemic make ends meet. You know, I don't want to detract from the challenges of doing that. The same is true with kind of the stimulus checks, even though, you know, that seems like a broad-based way to get stimulus dollars and financial support to a lot of families pretty quickly. It's not without its challenges also, given that not everybody files taxes, especially many who are part of safety net programs and some immigrant groups. So, you know, those are topics I think for us to kind of think about going forward and building a more robust kind of safety net system that can help families make ends meet during crises like these, and even in regular times, and just kind of the risks of modern work and the need to kind of be able to have that safety net so that you can invest in things like building a new business, going to school to get, you know, kind of retrained or additional skills for kind of shifting job opportunities.
Yeah, this year has sort of piloted so many social safety net programs for the first time ever. Question is to what extent they will continue, will be funded going forward, and are necessary. Let's talk about, on that note, what the future of work in California should look like. This is the opportunity for panelists to talk about your dreams. I am bringing this up in the context of, like I said earlier, a lot of federal money coming into the state, a lot of tax revenue at the state's disposal right now, though it's one-time funds, as Rob pointed out earlier. There is a significant opportunity to reform the state's unemployment insurance system, as we've already discussed, our childcare system, our tax systems, our higher education systems, the way that we create opportunities for upskilling and apprenticeship for people to start their own businesses. And by the way, there has been a major trend of women and people of color starting their own businesses, just as Aleda did during the pandemic, because traditional safety net resources didn't cover the gap between their income and their bills. Rob, I'd like to ask you to expand more on the shift towards telecommuting that you brought up earlier. You've also mentioned the need to invest in our education system. And I want you to talk more about the opportunities that lie there, but also what is needed to make the shift towards telecommuting much more equitable.
So right now, from all of our discussions with the employer community, we had developed a report to the governor and the legislature to be able to frame the issues, to give them kind of a roadmap on what they could look at and trying to be able to stimulate. This isn't about money, it's about policies. The foundation for business to grow their telecommuting. Yes, it's about infrastructure. Yes, about broadband. But a lot of it comes down to, we have to look at how our current labor laws apply to a telecommuting environment. And what does that mean in terms of meal and rest, for example? When you're at home, how do your breaks apply? All these things that ultimately enter into, policies that companies have to adapt to be able to allow their employees to, take the telecommuting option or be able to mandate a telecommuting option, but have the confidence that it's not going to create a litigious environment so that they put a lot of other, obviously company personnel or resources at risk. So, we actually did that report. We submitted it last November. And so we're hoping to continue that dialogue with them moving forward. With that, we also, so you talked about dreams, right? Jackie, didn't you just mention that? So just very quickly, a couple of thoughts on the education side. We would love to see the education component, particularly in, high school, be able to provide a different opportunity to teach people. And this is where Lorena, she's such a perfect example. We should be able to teach people how to start a business in high school, so they understand the fundamentals, even on a class project basis. Maybe it's not saying 2 years of classes, but a class where they understand how to access the system, what the system does from the Secretary of State's office, through all the different government agencies. We should teach them how to access benefits. We should teach them what EDD is. We should teach them, if they're in a crisis and there is, a future loss of a job, where do they go? What do they do? How do they do it? So that they have a working fundamental knowledge as they get ready to enter the workforce, whether it's, at a higher education level, or whether it's, most importantly, from a middle class, blue collar level, where they have some foundation to be able to understand this, as opposed to having to do it when a crisis strikes. So we have a lot of different thoughts and pieces around things like that, again, we want to talk about, but the foundation for us is we want to take advantage of how to grow telecommuting, and again, what that means in terms of the overall benefits.
Thanks, Rob. I think that this is a perfect chance to segue to Alayla, because I know that she echoes some of your thoughts there. Alayla, in your life, what are your goals going forward as a small business owner, and what do you need from the state to help you achieve the lasting economic stability you want for yourself and for your daughter?
Definitely, what he mentioned right now, it's so on point. Children need to learn how to pretty much be resilient to situations like this. To be resourceful and have ideas and creative ideas to how to move forward and build something new and not really depend on it. Based on my experience, I raised 3 teenagers, my niece and my nephews, and when they graduated high school, they didn't know what doing their income taxes was. They didn't know what EDD was. They didn't know what any of these resources were or what to do next, and it was sad that as teenagers in the US, they're 18 years old and they don't know many of these things that they have to do. There are basic things that adults do when we grow up. Now, my daughter is 11 years old, soon to be 12. We keep talking with her, and based on what she's seeing, she is more eager to continue her little business shop selling candies than learning history that at this point, it seems like it keeps repeating itself. So we have conversations with her and she's like, well, why is it point to learn something that happened so many years ago when apparently we haven't learned much from it? Why don't we learn something new? So there is a much need to teach kids how to be more resourceful when it comes to creating opportunities for themselves in case of impact like what we went through right now. For me personally, is the opportunity of learning how to open a new business, where to go, who to talk to the city without making us feel guilty for not knowing, because we have faced, many of us, and I'm pretty sure many of the small business that have come up lately have faced the same situation, that when we try to ask for the resources, sometimes we get the answers that we're like, our ignorance is a crime, and not knowing how to do it, it's a bad thing. And when reality is, we don't know how to do it. We're just learning as we go, because we have the need to create something for our families. Basically, having resources, in a way that it's, are easy to understand across the border, and not just to one group of people.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Assemblymember Gonzalez, I think on that note, and sort of segueing from the comments that Aleida made about history repeating itself, I will absolutely give you the chance to talk later about your dreams, but right now, what's at stake if we allow the pandemic to further cement inequality in our labor market? Like, why does this matter that we talk about changing the future of work?
Well, look, coming into the pandemic, there were disparities between women and men. There were disparities of people of color and white folks. But I'm going to point out the thing that nobody really likes to talk about, Ms. Ramirez and I probably can understand in a different way, and that's that, yes, these disparities existed, but the disparities for Latinas in particular was the largest. When you talk about pay equity, you're not talking about 12 cents on the dollar. You're talking, of a difference. You're talking Latinas are making, before the pandemic, 44 cents on the dollar of their white male counterpart. And that goes for high wage earners like surgeons all the way down to low wage earners like hotel workers. So something is wrong there, and it's going to need a really calculated approach. When we talk about Latinas in business, we opened it up to women's on boards, right? They opened up women on boards and we got great results, except when it came to Latinas, we're 20% of the population in particular, and yet we ended up less than 3% of new women on boards. We have a problem in California when it comes to a particular demographic. It's not our problem. We're hardworking people who unfortunately had to drop out of the workforce in larger numbers than anybody else to take care of kids, to deal with issues that they were facing. So, if we don't address this, I'm really interested to see, coming out of the pandemic, what that wage gap looks like. It's either going to get far worse, which is scary if you think about just how far behind we are. We've made incredible gains in California. We are the best in the nation when it comes to the difference between white women and white men. However, if you look at Latinas, we are the worst in the nation. Something is going wrong here. What happens now? Or did so many Latinas drop out of the workforce that you're actually not going to see even a result? That's scary too. So we have to learn from this moving forward. We have to learn how much we value childcare, and childcare as an option for people to go into as a career. It should be seen as a career. It should have training opportunities. It should be high end, both for the child and for the childcare provider. And that's something that we really need to double down on. When we talk about leave policies and when people can take leave, when we're talking about a portion of your income, all of these are things that were really highlighted. And last but not least, when we talk about workplace safety, something that isn't talked a lot. I know we want to go to telehealth and forget the workplace, but workplace safety measures in OSHA, we found that the unsafe working conditions that so many of our communities were facing really did, it extended to its worst possible outcome, right? The same places that we had OSHA violations and we knew there were problems before a pandemic ended up causing people's death. So we have some real issues that if we don't address, will only become even larger for communities of color, Black and Latino women in particular, Black and Latino communities in general.
Thank you. Sarah, what does the research show about the role of education, the safety net, the child care safety net in particular? Tell us about what is needed for an equitable recovery.
The risk of being the most dismal person on the panel, I have to start by saying we haven't had an equitable recovery over the past 40 years. that's kind of like the reality that we need to really think about breaking the mold in a substantial way if we want something different. The trajectory of all of the recessions over the past 40 years, with the exception of the dot-com bust, has been for the slowest recovery among those most impacted, which are low income families. So, that's just kind of the reality that I always start from. And, as we saw from the recovery from the Great Recession, a tight labor market is really the best thing for kind of improving wages at the low end of the spectrum, without making other major changes, structural changes that we're talking about here. But it seems like we're a long way off from that. So I think you pointed to the right areas where research is pretty clear that providing resources like safety net resources, things like the earned income tax credit, providing childcare, providing access to education, improves especially women's attachment to the labor force and their ability to kind of be upwardly mobile over time. The evidence there, I think, is pretty clear, and we have a lot of policy tools in the safety net space to provide resources to families. I think the past year has kind of provided some new experiments in that front for us to hopefully learn from, with the goal of taking some of the risk out of investing in skills, investing in kind of entrepreneurship and those kind of things for families. I would just say that, the piece education to me is a really critical piece, and that is obviously a huge investment for the state. And there, the evidence couldn't be more clear that education in today's economy, especially education beyond high school, is strongly associated with upward mobility. So I feel like the challenge in that space is how can we make sure that our institutions, our educational institutions, are identifying skill needs, making that clear to more Californians, kind of what those opportunities are, delivering it effectively, flexibly, and ultimately connecting with employers to really kind of build those kind of workforce skills and opportunities for the future. And then I would just end by saying, I think there's growing evidence about the connection of all of these things: childcare, safety, baseline kind of resources to meet basic needs, and education, that these things need to work together. Because we're talking about not just education for children today, but for workers who are trying to build a better future for themselves, like soon, now. And that means that we need to address the multiple challenges that families face and the needs that they have. And so some of the best evidence are on how those things can work together from job training programs that really do take account of the multiple kind of needs and challenges that adults face in today's economy.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Rob, this is an issue that I know is important to you. How have shifts in workers in businesses moving inside California and leaving California sort of affected the landscape as we talk about the future of work? And from your perspective, what is needed to retain economic opportunity in California?
That's a great question. It's one we track closely. So, we don't take the approach that, everything is leaving California. What we do is we track the data. We have that all documented. We watch the trends. So what is the regulatory environment? What is obviously the tax environment? What are the issues that impact the decisions, at the top of the companies of what they're doing? So where things stand right now from our research, we obviously see cost of living number one, and that still comes down to housing. I mean, we talk about a husband and wife or a couple having to both work. Why? A large part of that is the housing sector, because of where we are with the market, but where we are with our policies. The cost of living, when you look across the board, are impacting decisions on not just companies leaving here, but it's companies coming here, and it's ultimately companies who decide to grow how many jobs here. So our discussions with companies are all about, we need you to continue to grow jobs here. That's all about, Jackie, as you pointed out, that 1.5 million jobs. If we have companies move within California, that's a good thing. because they don't, if they can do their work and they don't all have to be down in Silicon Valley, well, then ideally that frees things up. That's what we want. I think that's what the governor wants. We'd be able to, make investments into the Central Valley. We get investments in Sacramento. People can go and move and find an affordable place to live, good schools, but then still be able to do the work and maybe not have to be able to get in their car and commute to Silicon Valley. So we are all about trying to look for those kinds of incentives so companies stay within the state, keep their jobs here, but have that flexibility. And we think with telecommuting now, that certainly is showing it's providing more of that flexibility. There's no question some companies are leaving. That makes the news. But we are still maintaining a large portion of our venture capital here. So that the key then is if the venture capital's here and the companies start here, will they stay here? Will they grow here? And that's really a big function of how California's policies are from a regulatory speed to market, employment law and all those pieces. So very dynamic, but that's, those are the pieces that we focus on.
Thanks, Rob. I am seeing the questions are pouring in. Before we go to questions, though, I want to make space to ask the Assembly member and Aleda each a question. Assembly member Gonzalez, when you envision the California economy of 2030, what key changes do you see? What policy changes would you propose to get there?
I'll wrap in my dreams for 2030 into it, not just, and I do want to point out, because I want to make sure Mr. Lapsley hears me, like, I think we can work on that education piece about learning how to start a business. Yes. I also think learning how to read a paycheck, understanding your rights and under labor law, something that is horribly missing in what we teach. I'd also add in how to ride public transit and some other things that could help our economy in general, or our future in general, that we should be teaching in school. And also opportunities, and this goes into 2030, opportunities that maybe aren't college. I think we have, and it's always a little controversial to say, but we focus so highly on, the conversations on A to G and how to get our kids into UC and CSU. And that's important. We need to provide those opportunities for those who want it. But as my daughter used to tell her teacher, despite everything, she said, a second-year journey person in IBEW makes more than my mom with her 3 degrees. So let's be honest about what opportunities are out there for students. Let's ensure that we're providing those kind of apprenticeships and high-end opportunities for good middle-class careers to people who you don't necessarily need to go to college for. And I think we've not focused as much as we should on kind of that transition. We're going to have construction workers who are aging out of the workforce. Where are we getting those from? And by the way, that intersects with the price of housing, right? If you don't have enough construction workers to do the work, we're really going to suffer on new housing development as well. So it's, it's circular in the way we approach it. I would hope by 2030 that we have a good grasp on the fact that look, I don't think it's useful to pay people not to work. I think that we can instead provide good, meaningful career opportunities, even for service sector work, for work that we haven't valued enough in this nation, and that would be a much better use of our money than somehow supplementing. I hear Ms. Ramirez speak, and she absolutely has the spirit of so many in my community that want to provide opportunities for the next generation. They're not looking for a handout, if you will. We need to invest in ensuring that those are good jobs. We need to hold companies accountable for service sector jobs that are going to exist here. Let's talk about warehouses. Warehouses are going to exist here. Amazon cannot do what they're doing without actually having hubs here. What are we demanding as far as worker safety, as far as pay, as far as equity in that sector, delivery sector? It's great we have startups, but if those startups are creating jobs that are actually devaluating the jobs in that sector, and that's what we had, of course, with the gig economy, where driving and delivery services used to be a middle-class career for UPS driver, now becomes, a low-wage job. Well, that hurts our economy as much as it helps it. I get it. If you talk to the governor and our budget surplus this year, yes, we love the revenue that we got from making billionaires, but come on, when do we ask those billionaires to share the revenue, in fact, with the people doing the work, not just giving it to government to spend on social service programs? So I think a rebalancing of that, I would much rather have government or have companies not be paying into our budget, instead provide the kind of jobs that are unnecessary to seek those social services in that safety net. People who work 40 hours a week or who work full time shouldn't have to rely on the government. I mean, that is one of the things that we've relied on too long. And I'm not saying take away the social safety net. I'm all for having it there until we right size the economy in a way that the businesses are actually providing livable wage jobs with benefits that keep people sturdy.
Thank you, Assembly Member. I imagine that if we gave you more time, you could give us a manifesto for the future of 2030.
I have lots of views, yes.
Aleda, I'd like to finish the conversation with you. And you have a policymaker here on the line listening to you, and we have a lot of people in the audience watching this conversation. I want to know, what do you want state policymakers to know about you and your family and your community as they're crafting policies that will shape our economy going forward?
Well, everything needs to be, in a way, redesigned. Education, housing, benefits, tax. Personally, being a single mom, housing was one of the biggest impact for us. Not only the fact that we couldn't provide for that, but the rent increase in the middle of pandemic. Not everybody was able to fall into the moratorium, so we were impacted by a rent increase in the middle of a pandemic. So there are still gaps in laws when it comes to housing, and low-income families were being hit pretty bad. So that's one of the biggest things that we need support from the state. Coming June, what is it going to be for all of us who are still late on our rent? Coming June, what is it going to be to all of us that still don't have a steady job? Me as a startup business, what's going to happen then? What opportunities I have there? There's so many topics to talk about what needs to be done in policies when it comes to helping the community. We're the one building California, and we're the one being impacted directly. We are the labor force is the one that got impacted directly. I hear a lot about telework, but that doesn't apply to all Californians. California is an agricultural and developing state that needs roads, buildings, food, and so many other things that cannot be done from home. So what for that class, what for that group of people? What's going to happen? What the state has for us when it comes to building the economy on that side without being impacted or being homeless in the next 30 days or the next 60 days?
Thank you so much. I think it's time, a little bit late, but better now than never, to open the conversation to audience questions. We are getting a ton of questions, and I'm going to do my best to sort through them and kick them off to the right person. Panelists, feel free to jump in if you feel like you have an answer to provide as well. Thank you also to our participants who have been keeping up a really lively chat. It's awesome to see you listening and talking with each other, as well as shooting us questions. So keep them coming. I think this is a very interesting question, one that I report on a lot. I want to ask Sarah to answer this question. This touches the safety net aspect of our conversation. And I'm going to actually combine two questions here. Someone asks, what are solutions that don't put the burden on poor people to have to apply or jump through a bunch of hoops just to get support? They talk about the Disaster Relief Assistance for Immigrants program, which was a $500 aid program distributed through nonprofits, but funded through the state, which many immigrants spent days calling hundreds of times to try to get through to someone and put their name on the list. They talk about state rental assistance. And I'm going to bundle that with another question that talks about the issue that so much of this is online and not everyone has access to the internet. So as someone who researches safety net, what are better models?
This is such an important question, and I think this past year has kind of been interesting in this respect. As I mentioned, I think at some point we distributed a lot more aid through the tax system, which in general would have fewer kind of hoops and conditions, and much of our safety net programs, which are a number of different programs serving multiple purposes, and with various kind of eligibility requirements and kind of other requirements to keep up the aid. So it's not without its kind of problems, as I mentioned, like not all people file taxes. A lot of immigrants do file taxes with an ITIN number, but not all of them do. So that raises some questions about kind of who we may be missing, but nonetheless is potentially a more kind of quick and efficacious way to kind of reach a broad base of Californians with kind of safety net support. And there, in the American Rescue Plan, there are kind of ways that they are trying to make kind of distributing through the tax system not just an annual thing, but monthly or quarterly, are options there. So I think that's a very kind of promising route to pursue. The state also, California in particular, expanded aid for kind of immigrant groups, as the question stated, not without its challenges, but at least recognizing some of the kind of holes and those who are missed by that kind of support. I would say, we've seen a little bit less growth in safety net programs during the past year than we expected based on what we saw in the labor market. And the question about accessing online is, I think really pertinent, because that seems to be one of the explanations that might have been kind of keeping some families back from accessing the programs that are available due to kind of how they would be able to kind of fill out applications and that kind of thing. So these are really ripe areas for us to kind of demonstrate better ways to reach the targeted populations by safety net programs.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah. Here's a very interesting question. I feel like I should have recruited the audience to moderate this panel. We have great questions from the audience. Rob, can you speak, and other panelists feel free to jump in. Can you speak to the current debate that this audience member describes as the labor shortage / living wage / high government assistance current debate? So we're talking about the debate that expanded unemployment benefits are actually incentivizing people not to go back to work. Can you speak to how true that is from your perspective, and how that dynamic does or does not affect jobs post-pandemic, especially at the entry level or low wage jobs?
So excellent question. I would never profess to be, the single voice on that, because obviously there's a tremendous amount of analysis going on and intertwined with the politics, if you will, at the federal level on that issue, certainly. And I know, others like Sarah is probably looking at that, and many other very smart people. But the bottom line from what we see in discussions with the companies is, number one, yes, jobs are going unfilled. Companies are starting to reopen. I think it's fair to say during this whole pandemic, companies, especially small businesses, have really worked hard to protect, their employees and their customers. And now they're focused on what it's going to take to reopen and do the same thing and ensure, that everyone has confidence to be able to come back into the workforce. So with that, we're talking about 8 million jobs nationally, potentially, that are open. There is no question some sectors see that under the current benefits, that they obviously they're getting higher benefits than maybe necessarily where they were, based on what their hourly wage was, based on how many hours they were working, all those things. That has now put pressure in a positive way on wage growth, right? And again, I think Sarah spoke to this. So we're now seeing that happen quickly. Look at what Chipotle announced, for obviously from a small business perspective, in 3 years, if you join Chipotle, you can be making, over a 6-figure salary if you move up. And that's what this is all about. It's about getting started in the workforce at a certain salary level and then work your way up to be able to get to the salary levels that ultimately, obviously, allow us to have a future for our families. So what we see right now is some states are pushing hard on obviously wanting to trim back on what's happening with the federal benefits on when they expire. The companies themselves are not weighing in on that debate at the moment. Okay, we'll see what happens in the next 30 days or so, or 60 days, but they're watching, they're recruiting, but they're not asking for a change yet, recognizing, where some of the obviously support has to come from for individuals to recover. But I expect within maybe after that 60 days or after June 30th, that there could be more of a discussion from the business community about that. But right now, it seems to be more of what's happening with some of the individual states and not right here.
If I could, I just, there's so much else that we're not talking about that plays into this, that I think to have an honest discussion, we need to lay on the table. And I don't have the research, and Sarah might have some of it that gives us the direct. I don't know that there's one answer, but look, schools not being opened, that is a large reason why people aren't returning to work. I'll tell you, I until schools open on April 12th, I couldn't return here. I would literally fly up for session and fly back home because I have kids at home. What am I going to do? I mean, it's one thing to leave them one day to try to get on Zooms. If I leave them for a week, they're going to be out the whole, it's just not feasible. So we had that. They're kind of inching back into school, but until we have them back full time, or we have childcare options for them, or some sort of hub issue, that can't be resolved. And that plays into some of this. The other is the thing that we're seeing, the signs, we need cooks. Okay, let's be honest. In California, the #1 profession for excess deaths were cooks, chefs, bakers. If you combine them, you're talking 1,000 extra people that died last year because of COVID. We assume because COVID, obviously, excess deaths. So how many, this is morbid and terrible, but how many of our low-wage service worker workforce did we kill off in this past year, right? The other issue is immigration. Look, a lot of folks working in restaurants weren't necessarily under their own documentation, and some of them chose to go back to their home country because it wasn't feasible to stay here. We had no safety net. They couldn't apply for unemployment insurance. So you have a depletion of a workforce that we should talk about how we bring back. We can't function in California without immigrant workers. That's just a reality. It's time to treat those workers like the essential workers that they are, and to give them a path to citizenship so we don't end up in this space again. Finally, we've got to talk about the fact that low-wage workers were forced to work for low wages because that was what was available. So forcing people into dangerous situations where they don't have childcare, where they don't have the ability to take care of their family for extra low wages, that's a problem and a discussion we should be having at the national level and here in California in general. Yes, workers will do whatever they have to do to put a house over their head and food on the table for their kids. We heard Ms. Ramirez talk about it. She's just going to get done what needs to get done. Is that something that we should strive for? Having to have 3 jobs, working, 60, 70, 80 hours a week, that's not good for our kids. That's not good for our communities. And we've got to have that as an honest, open discussion about where we go in the future, right? I obviously come out of organized labor. This upsets people, but our slogan was always like, one job should be enough. You should be able to, whether you're doing a service sector job or you're doing a high-end, C-suite job, the one job should be able to pay enough and give you the foundation that you can take care of your kids and take care of your family. So I welcome this discussion. I say in solidarity, these workers don't get pressured to go back before and lose out on these essentials for your family, taking care of your kids, making sure. We're going to have huge learning gaps that happen this year, and it's only going to be made worse if you tell low-wage workers they have to come back to work, in a shorter time frame until we get kids back in school. So just so many problems that are intermixed in this.
Yeah.
Jackie, if I could add one thing onto that, because I appreciate what some of the women said, but particularly about education. So we're coming quickly up on a time where the schools have got to be crystal clear about whether they're going back or not. And the governor has worked with them and tried to be flexible with them with the carrot and the stick. Lots of carrots billions of carrots, if you will, but there's going to have to come a time where they got to have a stick. And that means that they have got to stand up and say, we're going back in full time, because that will send the signal. And we need that by June. So then, to someone Gonzalez's point, so, you know, whether it's the mother or the father overseeing the kids, you know, virtual education, they know it's time where they can now with confidence go back to the workplace, and it's not going to change. It's not going to be inconsistent. They have a very clear direction to be able to say with confidence that they can start to make decisions and move back. And she's right. It is critical. And we are going to need very clear, decisive direction for the workplace for people to make those decisions.
Thank you both. I want to ask an excellent question from the audience, and I will leave this up to whoever wants to jump in. The question is about the potential in enormous amounts of money coming into the state under Biden's infrastructure plan. How does his plan or alternate plans about, you know, the Republicans in Congress have their own infrastructure plan that's also massive, though half as massive. What can California do from a policy standpoint to make sure that investment in infrastructure in California, again, is equitable? And this is a buzzword of today, equitable, but it's a really important buzzword that we need to not let lose its meaning, right? So what can California do to make sure that that money comes in and actually creates good paying, protected jobs?
Well, I'm sorry, I just have to give the plug. I know this will probably make Mr. Lapsey happy, but you know, I did like some of the PROACT stuff being put into some of the language. Look, the fact is, if you want good, equitable jobs for people of color, they're going to have to be union jobs. And when you look at sectors that have become, and I'll go back to the very start when you talk about nurses, and I grew up with this. So the change in nursing being one of lower middle class to one of upper middle class, all had to do with union density. And so, quite frankly, giving workers a chance to have a voice on the job, giving them a chance to make more money is essential for Black and brown workers, especially in the service sector. So we've got to figure out a way that service sector jobs can and will be unionized as a way and allow collective bargaining to do it. And I like that that's in the transportation. The other thing I would say is a focus on public transit. We've got to invest more on public transit. It's not only an environmental imperative, but you know, when we're talking about where housing should go and where it should be and what we should do, we really have to look at a lot of that. So those are my two takeaways with the.
If I could just jump in, I would agree that, you know, this is tied a lot to union jobs, and those are good kind of middle income, at least, positions. One key pathway to that is through apprenticeship programs. And I think, you know, the community colleges play a role in that, but also kind of other organizations. And that's a critical pathway for kind of achieving the equity goals as well, making sure that more Californians, more diverse Californians have access to that kind of training program. But I would also just want to comment that, you know, another buzzword that we're dealing with is infrastructure, because I think we're kind of piling all kinds of things onto it, and it's not wrong. You know, I think the infrastructure plan that I've seen, you know, includes childcare and other kind of healthcare roles, and those are essential for modern work, as we've been talking about today. So thinking about kind of opportunities to improve kind of work options in the childcare space, as well as address affordability, which are sometimes goals that are in conflict, is critical as part of kind of a broader definition of infrastructure that supports our kind of workforce going forward.
Thank you. I'm reading through the chat and seeing all sorts of ideas that people are throwing out about policies that they want to see in California. And then we have a wonderful and open-ended question. Someone asks, I'd like to hear about some revolutionary solutions, more creative and specific ideas for how to address inequality directly. This is a very broad question, and I want to open it up to anyone who feels they have a revolutionary solution that they want to put on the table for this conversation.
I'd like to talk about full employment. And I think we don't talk about it enough. Quite frankly, if we are really committed to full employment, that means we redirect some of our social service programs for this. Is it not a job to stay home with your child for the first few years of life to give them an opportunity? We should, in fact, pay, I don't want to say women, but it's usually women, but a family member an adequate wage to stay home with their child. That is a job. You can reach full employment through a variety of ways, but we've never explored, should we pay people to go to school? Should we pay teenagers to stay in school in underserved communities? Is that their job? Can we incentivize? So I think there is a way that we could redirect social services that says, you know, if you're in the trades, it's great, your apprenticeship is paid. There are too many apprenticeships or training opportunities that are unpaid. So I think that we can extend the workforce, and that's good when people are earning money, and that we can go back to a day, give another example, you know, that we have, you know, more people to help out in schools. You have more opportunities for direct, you know, care in school and after school to help students who are using, now that we are a little more honest with ourselves, that are using schools as their full-time childcare. You know, let's buffer that up, and let's ensure that there's opportunity for communities like mine, I think, through a full employment kind of model and not just a social service model.
Thank you. Any other revolutions that panelists want to start?
If I could just add one thing onto what the Assemblywoman said, because her comments are interesting, and we all know that she looks at these things in a very, you know, big picture way. But what I appreciate about one of the things she just said is, you know, when we do these things, it's time to look at the whole system from top to bottom. And that, again, this comes back to the oversight piece. If we want to change the policies, particularly for like a childcare piece, then let's take the existing resources we have, and how can we restructure them to achieve that goal and truly help, you know, the families from an equity standpoint we're trying to help. It's not about just layering on one thing after another, because as we know, that ultimately can't get you to where you want to go. You can't keep adding on costs and then trying to add on taxes if you don't take what you have and redirect it in a policy perspective with the right decisions to be able to get it where it needs to go. And that's kind of something we haven't done for a while, and we want to go in those directions. And I appreciate what the Assemblywoman said, but if we could all join together, all of us join together, every sector join together in a way that could provide support to the governor and legislature to have a process where we could honestly look at how we restructure and redirect to then get to some of those goals, I think you'd see a massive change in California in addressing some of these equity pieces, but also set us on a very good policy path. So that would ultimately be my dream.
Thank you, Rob. Alayla, please go ahead.
Yes, something that Mrs. Gonzalez mentioned, paying kids to stay at school. Well, wouldn't it be better to reduce the college tuition fees or university payments, that it has been pretty much impossible for young adults lately to get into great universities or colleges because of the high price, and they get to go to work. And personally, like I mentioned earlier, I raised 3 teenagers that now are young adults. They can't afford to live on their own. They cannot pay for college tuition, that are like in a way in between. So why don't we do something to support these people this group to have a better education? I'm 42 years old, but compared to life 20 years ago, I was able to afford a room on my own and be out of the house and work, and not literally study, but work. Rather, now I have a young adult at home who is 21 years old. He's in college. He can't afford to pay for his own apartment because the gap between the income and the housing costs. There are so many things that we can do to change and transition into a new era in California on housing, education, and like she said, paying a family member to stay at home while taking kids young age, it's so fundamental. As a mom, it's such a great idea, but also helping the young adults on how to enter the adulthood without charging them for a chance to create a new lifestyle for themselves. Education has come out so high in California that college or universities are nowhere to be reached for many of Californians. Me as a single mom trying to get into college right now, it seems like a joke, you know. And so there is so many things that we can do to do that.
Thank you so much, Aleda. I think that's a perfect place to end this conversation. I want to extend so much gratitude to our panelists for taking the time today, offering up their expertise, and to our participants for contributing and asking excellent questions. I'm going to be saving your chats and mining them for story ideas and questions to ask policymakers and leaders and researchers and Californians later. So thank you all. Thank you to the Milken Institute and CalMatters for hosting this event. And we're looking forward for you all attending our next Future of Work event. Dave, when's that happening? Is he on?
It'll be in about 2 months. It'll be in July.
All right. Okay, stay tuned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.